As the Wesleyan Methodist Church celebrates 50 years of service in Australia and prepares to continue its ministry into the 21st century, it is appropriate to reflect on its history and its pioneers. Kingsley Ridgway was a man of vision who, under God, brought the Wesleyan Methodist Church to Australia. As an RAAF chaplain during the Second World War, he was impressed by a testimony to conversion and entire sanctification related by an American serviceman. He subsequently studied the Articles of Discipline, and after corresponding with Wesleyan Methodist Church officials in America, on November 1st, 1945, he was appointed the official representative of the denomination in Australia. The first public meeting was held in late 1945 at 266 Flinders Lane, Melbourne. By the end of 1946, meetings were being conducted in northern Victoria with Les Archbold as pastor at Bendigo and throughout Melbourne. The first camp meeting was held at Barwon Heads in December 1946. Among those who supported Kingsley Ridgway were J.T. Carnell, Aubrey Carnell and Reverend Gilbert McLaren. The following years saw fellowships and churches being established in city and country locations. In 1947, Hunting Tower in South Street, Glenroy, was purchased at the price of £3,000. This was to become the Wesleyan Methodist Bible College and church headquarters. In 1948, the college's principal, Reverend Leo G. Cox, and his family arrived from America. Others to visit and minister to the needs of the fledgling church were Miss Grace Wood, a missionary to India, and Dr. J. R. Swager, who presided over the first annual conference, which was held at the Labour Hall, Severn Street, Yarraville in 1947. The work in Yarraville had its beginnings in tent meetings with J.T. Carnell as its pastor, later moving to Sunshine. In 1947, the Kahuna Mission Church opened, with Edgar Randall appointed class leader and local preacher. In 1948, Phil Favaloro was appointed to West Coburg. In the same year, local people of Dalton's Bridge, Kahuna, began building a place of worship. In 1949, a Sunday school commenced at College Church, and the following year the church was organized with 6 members and was pastored by Leo Cox with James Ridgway assisting. In that same year, the Baldwin at Hyatt Fellowships were commenced. Aubrey Carnell began pastoring the church at Kahuna, and Mrs. Esther Cox organized the Women's Missionary Society at College Church.
The Bible College was an integral part of the Wesleyan Methodist Church's beginnings. Initially, it operated as a boarding house, but in 1949, the building was dedicated to God as a Bible college. The first year of studies was underway with the enrolment of 7 students, and 1951 saw the first students graduating: James Ridgway, Charles Wilson, and William Morris. The visit of Dr. Rufus and Mrs. Ruby Reisdorf brought a touch of revival to the campus and conference of 1952 and left the church with clarified vision and renewed commitment. James Ridgway and Aubrey Carnell were ordained. In 1953, James Ridgway left to pursue studies in America. He would return with his family in 1959 and would be elected as conference president, also leading the Bible College into the 1960s as its principal. Reverend Aubrey Carnell and his family returned to Melbourne from Kahuna in 1953 to pastor the college church, and with his wife Hazel took up duties as dean and matron of the college. In December 1953, Robert Motke and his family arrived from America to relieve the Coxes. Reverend Motke became college principal and conference president. Student numbers increased, and a gospel team toured Victoria and New South Wales, gaining experience in ministry. In the mid-50s, redecoration and building works were underway to accommodate the growing number of students and their families at the college. With much commitment, dedication and support, the Bible College, taking In the Beauty of Holiness as its motto, was training men and women to faithfully promote the gospel. With this knowledge, they would take the message of holiness into the next decade and beyond.
During the 1950s, churches that began as fellowships were establishing places of worship. The church continued to grow. A hall was rented in West Coburg and work was launched in Launceston, Tasmania by Kingsley and Dorcas Ridgway. Buildings were erected in Hyatt and Balwyn. Other churches to be formed during this period were Hilton Street, Glenroy in 1957, Elizabeth, South Australia in 1958 and Dandenong, Victoria in 1960. Family camps and youth camps had become an integral part of the ministry of the church. In 1960, a campsite at Healesville was purchased. Strong Sunday schools operated in most of the churches at this time. In 1961, Christian Youth Crusaders and the Young Missionary Workers Band were organised. In 1962, Aubrey Carnell became conference president, and in that year, Dr. Paul Rees, Dr. Thorpe and Reverend Gordon Wolfe visited Australia. In 1963, the newly erected sanctuary for the College Church, Glenroy, was completed and dedicated. In the same year, fellowships commenced at Vermont in Victoria and at Cabramatta in New South Wales, later relocated to Busby under Reverend Doug Pinch. In 1962, following the purchase of a printing press, Wesley Press Australia was established. The following year, the magazine, The Wesleyan Messenger, was printed by Wesley Press. In the mid-1960s, the church in Australia experienced a steady increase in membership. The possibility of commencing a work in Western Australia was explored when a leadership team visited in 1966.
Kingsley Ridgway, together with Walter Hodgkin, travelled to Papua New Guinea in 1961 to commence a mission under the sponsorship of the Australian Church. Permission to establish a mission at Koroba in the highlands among the Huli people was obtained in August following an exploratory trip in May. The work was to expand to Tagaroo among the Wiru people when another holiness mission passed on their field to us. Soon others reinforced the developing work. Jean Ridgway and Dorothy Hodgkin joined their husbands on the field. Bob Gladwin established the educational program and Fran Leake the medical program. Ray and Gwen Akers, Jan Ipsum, Delwyn Hughes, Dorothy Randall and Keith and Marge Golding were among the Australians to take up the challenge. At one stage, there were more Australian Wesleyan missionaries in Papua New Guinea than Wesleyan pastors in Australia. Kingsley Ridgway was repatriated back to Australia following a heart attack, but the work continued unabated with reinforcements coming from the Australian and the American Church. In due course, the mission was reassigned to the denominational World Missions Department with international personnel. Walter Hodgkin, Keith Golding and Don Bray taking their turns as field superintendents. Other Australians to serve have been Dallas and Ruth Thomas, and Don and Cherie Floyd. A well-established national Indigenous church in Papua New Guinea, numbering some 10,000, bears witness to the power of the gospel and the faithful ministry of our people. Walter and Dorothy Hodgkin's recent retirement to Australia marks the end of a lifetime of ministry in Papua New Guinea and the end of a remarkable era.
All right, now you sing out in God. He come close to you, now strong in you, now helping you come up sorry, true, long sin belong you. Now who's going to like play? Hold it for him. Plenty too much. All right. Give me praise. Give them a burden for the souls of others. Help them, Lord Jesus. Feel the need of others and have soul burden. But oh, God, have mercy on those who are not Christians. May this be the hour in which they repent. Oh, gracious God. Lord, the blessed Spirit. Help them, Lord Jesus, to repent with a deep godly sorrow.
During the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the Wesleyan Methodist Church of Australia experienced a period of sifting. Churches were closed and properties sold at Launceston, Hyatt, Dalton's Bridge and Elizabeth. The Vermont Fellowship became independent of the denomination and the Healesville campsite was sold. Student intake at the Bible College had decreased, and in the absence of James Ridgway, Aubrey Carnell maintained a leadership presence until the arrival in 1966 of Reverend Arthur Calhoun, who served as principal from 1967 to 1969. The Victorians welcomed new ministerial personnel, with Reverend Bryce Harton appointed to College Church in 1967. In 1973, the Wesleyan Methodist Bible College became Kingsley College, an apt tribute to the founder, Kingsley Ridgway. Reverend William Foster, arriving in Australia in 1973 with his family, was appointed as pastor to the Sunshine Church the following year and to the college faculty. It was at this time that Queensland was set to embrace the Wesleyan Methodist mission under the leading of God and through the pioneering efforts of Reverend Don Hardgrave. From the first meetings at the home of Reverend Hardgrave and his wife Dulcie in Annerley, 1974, until the completion of his term in 1990 as district superintendent, some 30 churches had been planted throughout Queensland. Among the earliest churches were Clontarf, which became Redcliffe, Joyful News Mission, whose members voted to become a Wesleyan Methodist church, Gayndah, Maryborough and Rockhampton. Churches were also being planted and established in New South Wales and Victoria under the leadership of Dr. Jim Ridgway, who was elected Superintendent of the Australian Church in 1975. In Queensland, the chapel and residence at Coochie Island were given to the denomination. There was movement between states, with personnel lending support to new churches and students from northern states enrolling at Kingsley College. Many notable events occurred in the 1970s, including the opening of the Pleasant Surprise bookshop at Mount Gravatt, Queensland, and the publication of Kingsley Ridgway's book, Feet Upon the Mountains, which recounted the beginnings of the mission in Papua New Guinea. The hymnal, A New Song, was approved and was to be revised in 1983. Reverend Dallas Clarnett served as Assistant Superintendent and College Vice Principal. Tom Blythe and Don Hardgrave were also designated Assistant Superintendents in New South Wales and Queensland respectively. In 1978, the title District Superintendent Emeritus was conferred on Kingsley Ridgway. His death in 1979 marked the end of a memorable era in the life of the church and the completion of the life's work of one man, carried out to the glory of God. The 1980s ushered in some notable innovations on the national scene. In 1982, 3 districts were defined and structured within a multi-district conference. Annual district conferences and a biennial national conference were approved, with Dr. Ridgway continuing as National Superintendent through 1984. He would be succeeded by Reverend Don Hardgrave, then Reverend Thomas Blythe, whose capable administrative skills and desire for the church to experience a revival in holiness were evident throughout his term as National Superintendent. New churches and fellowships were being established throughout the 1980s, with others recommencing their ministries. The first state conferences of the Queensland and Victorian districts were held in 1983. In 1984, Lynn Birch, assistant to Reverend Bill Foster at Sunshine, became the first woman to be ordained in the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Australia, with Dr. Ridgway and District Superintendent Mel Lockhart officiating at her ordination. She would later become Reverend Mrs. Lynn Holland. 1984 was also the year that Tongan fellowships in New South Wales began to worship as Wesleyan Methodists. In 1985, Reverend John Falatau was approved as the coordinator of the Tongan ministry, which later developed in Victoria and Queensland. On the college scene, the library was dedicated in 1981. And in 1985, Reverend Dr. David Wilson began his service as principal. Both the college and the national churches were enriched through the ministry of numerous overseas visitors who brought their expertise and gave support in leadership roles. Some of these were Roger Rounds, Don and Eleanor Barber, Mary Ann Barnett, Linda and George Eberly, Harvey and Shirley Tabor, Stuart and Janet Holsing, Wayne and Bonnie Macbeth, and Phil and Kathy Bentz. Others visited for short periods, their impact nonetheless effective. Reverend Jimmy Johnson, Professor Wayne Cox, Dr. Virgil Mitchell, and Dr. Charles Carter, to name but a few. In 1988, Reverend A.H. Carnell was given the title National Superintendent Emeritus, and the following year an honorary doctorate was conferred on him by the college.
1988 also saw the publication of Reverend Don Hardgrave's book, For Such a Time, which recalls the history of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Australia. John Wesley's motto, "The world is my parish," could well be applied to the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Australia in the light of the establishing of ministries among our Chinese, Vietnamese, Tongan and Sri Lankan brothers and sisters. 2 families, the Rodrigos and the Coultons, trained at Kingsley College, then returned to Sri Lanka to minister to their people. Other leaders have equipped themselves in order to minister to their congregations here in Australia. Reverend Graham Carnell and Reverend Kent Ridgway share the distinction of being third-generation ordained ministers of the Wesleyan Methodist Church.
The establishment of the North Queensland District and the opening of work in Devonport, Tasmania, and in Adelaide, South Australia in this decade are strategic developments in fulfilling the Church's mission to reach out.
In January 1997, as the Australian Wesleyan Methodist Church celebrates its Golden Jubilee, it will be poised to prayerfully further its mission, widen its vision, and contemplate its direction as God leads its men and women, its young people and its children into the 21st century. To God be the glory.